We're going to be talking about this year's Rolex 24 for a very long time. It had everything from intense manufacturer battles, a late race charge for the race lead, plenty of beating and banging, and there was also a pretty iconic bird moment. But with round 2 at Sebring right around the corner, let's take a look back at some takeaways from the Rolex 24 and how they might apply to the rest of the season. Now, BMW have taken plenty of shots from fans since that M Hybrid V8 was introduced, and to be fair, they've mostly been well deserved. After all, they've finished a distant last in the manufacturer standings in the first 2 years of the GTP class, and in that time frame only managed a meager 6 podiums. They've largely been uncompetitive. Now, despite an overall struggle in 2024, they did start to show life towards the end of the year. It all really culminated at Indy last year, where they were quick pretty much right off the truck. However, it wasn't until the second half of that race that they truly came alive. In the end, it would be the 24 that would lead 51 laps en route to a 1-2 finish for BMW in the 6-hour-long battle on the bricks. I mean, you might recall they got their first win technically at the 2023 6 Hours at the Glen after Porsche was disqualified in post-race tech. But this win at Indy was no doubt a huge one for the team and for that BMW program as a whole. They followed that strong Indy performance up with a strong outing at Petit Le Mans, a strong outing until the number 25 had to retire from the race with a fuel system issue. That being said, the sister number 24 was still able to manage a 4th place finish. Not quite a podium, but still a solid run on the weekend. This year's Rolex 24 was perhaps the first time that BMW looked like the favorites for a win. They looked quick in testing at the Roar, being among the leaders in almost all of the sessions and putting down the quickest time of the weekend. They'd carry that testing speed through to the Rolex weekend as well. There, they'd capture pole for the Rolex 24, laying down again the fastest lap time of the weekend. And they'd carry that strong pace into the race. There, they were strong, especially in the early going, leading 57 of the first 58 laps. As the race carried on, they would fall back a little bit, but were still hanging on strong through the night. And then when the sun rose again in the morning, that car really looked to come alive again. In the closing hours of the race, the number 24 was right in the thick of it for the GTP class win. Unfortunately, they'd make some late race contact, cause some damage to that car that would see them ultimately fall off the lead lap. But if it hadn't been for that contact, if it hadn't been for that damage, BMW was going to be right in the thick of the fight with Porsche and Acura in that final stint for that race win. I think this opening round at the Rolex was just a culmination of how far that team and that program have come, and while it's still probably too early to say that the 24 and the 25 are slam dunks to be championship contenders in GTP, with the pace that they've developed, it's pretty clear that they're going to be in the hunt for one, if not multiple race wins in 2025, and they look to be a consistent threat to get on the podium. The offseason is generally an opportunity for the governing body to take a look back at some of the rules and regulations and tinker with things a little bit. This past offseason was no different. New for 2025, Imsa made some changes to how the GTD Pro and GTD classes are split for race restarts, for race starts, and how they qualify. Since the introduction of the GTD Pro class in 2022, the GTD and GTD Pro cars both qualified together. They both started the race together. They started any restarts together, all in one big clump of GTD cars. Now, on one hand, this made sense. The GTD and GTD Pro cars are virtually identical after all, and the only difference really being the driver combinations that you can have that race in the class. However, this large clump of GTD and GTD Pro cars being mixed together also created some problems. The GTD and GTD Pro classes would often combine for 20 to 30 entries at any given race. And never mind the race, when you have that many cars in one small 15-minute qualifying session, things can get a little bit hectic. In that hectic qualifying session, let's say you're a GTD Pro car and you don't get a great lap in, well, you're not just starting at the back of your 7, 8, 9 car GTD Pro class. No, you're starting all the way back behind 27 mixed GTD and GTD Pro cars. A pretty big penalty. As if that wasn't bad enough, those 27 or so GTD and GTD Pro cars, well, you have to start to pass them throughout the race, and maybe there's 5 GTD cars that are ahead of you at the start of the race. Well, you have to pass all 5 of them, who are in virtually equal equipment, before you can even start to have a battle with somebody in your class. Now, this all changed again for the start of the 2025 season, and the 2025 Rolex 24 was the first time we saw these changes implemented. Now, the GTD Pro and GTD classes both have separate 15-minute qualifying sessions, so really no more traffic issues. On race starts, the GTD Pro class cars all start ahead of the GTD class cars, which means when the green flag drops, all those cars are immediately in the thick of the battle between their own class entries. Now, while we've only seen these changes in place for one race, it was immediately obvious at the Rolex that these were the right changes to make. The qualifying changes at a bit of a larger track like the Rolex aren't going to be very obvious right away. However, when we get to some of these shorter tracks on the schedule, think of maybe a CTMP for instance, these will be much more noticeable. And the changes to split the cars for the restart was incredible. I mean, just look at the battles that we saw in both the GTD Pro and the GTD classes in the final stint of the race. The battle for that GTD win was elbows out, a bit of door banging, and more important, it was super close. The same, of course, could be said for GTD Pro. Having everyone bunched up with their fellow class competitors and not separated by essentially traffic for a restart led to even closer racing and more battles throughout the race, which in turn made for a very entertaining finish. These changes were great ones in my opinion, and I think it's going to be a ton of fun to watch how these GTD Pro and GTD battles further evolve as the season goes on. As I said on the top, we're going to be talking about this year's Rolex 24 for a very long time. All weekend, it was a toss-up as to who the favorites were in all 4 classes. In GTP, we saw BMW, Cadillac, Acura, and Porsche all look like they had the pace to contend for the win. And this is probably the first race of this new GTP era that we could reasonably say that any of the full season manufacturers had a crack at the win. I think this is just a sign of things to come for this year. I mean, we've already seen Porsche and Cadillac take the first 2 GTP championships, but you look at the return of Meyer-Shank Racing in the Acura stable and the emergence of BMW that I talked about, and we could be looking at one heck of a championship battle this year. Those manufacturer battles aren't just present in GTP either. They might even be more intense in the GTD Pro class. At the Rolex, I'm sure you're very familiar at this point with the BMW and Corvette showdown. I mean, it had us consumed in it in the final hours of the race. But not to be lost in that battle, you can't forget that Ford started the race first and second, led over 200 laps, and went on to finish first and third. We had last year's GTD Pro champions Rexy leading 185 laps. Pfaff is starting to look like Pfaff again after a strong opening race with their new Lamborghini. Then there's Vassar Sullivan and their Lexus. I mean, you can't forget about them. Oh yeah, and we also saw how strong the Ferraris were last year, right? There's a full season Ferrari in the GTD Pro class this year. There's no doubt that both of the GTD classes are going to provide us with some great racing this year, but I just can't take my eyes off this GTD Pro class. It's no longer that 5 or 6 car grid that we saw just a couple of seasons ago. It's an all-out dogfight now, manufacturer versus manufacturer, factory driver versus factory driver, and some elite team versus elite team battles that we arguably haven't really seen since the GTLM days. This all goes to say that these manufacturer battles are going to be great to watch this year. Not only in the GTP and these GTD classes, but also all throughout Imsa. I mean, let's not forget here, the Michelin Pilot Challenge offered up some pretty darn good racing at the Rolex weekend, and the GTD X class of the VP Sports Car Challenge also provided us with some great racing in their first races of the year. Speaking of that GTD X class, you can learn all about the IMSA's newest GT3 class right here. Huge shout out to all of the channel supporters. If you too want to support the show, you can head to patreon.com/offtheS's or click that join button below. Once again, though, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.